Today we are going to go through the process of installing SQL Server 2014 Standard Edition. I'm thinking the best place to start to give some instruction on SQL would obviously be to install SQL for the first time. Currently I have a VM with Windows 2012, Server 2012, and I'm getting ready to install SQL Server for the first time. This SQL Server will be a standalone install. It's for a dev machine, so we'll be installing a single instance on a single server for uses of development. To start with, when you install SQL, you need to have .NET Framework 3.5 features installed. To do that, I've already gotten through that point, and so I'll do another video to kind of precede this one in case you're having trouble installing .NET 3.5. It's actually fairly easy, but it's also something that if you've already dismounted the media, installing Windows, you'll have to remount the media and then go through the process of installing .NET 3.5. That, as I said earlier, has already been done. And so there are a few things that you want to consider before you start installing SQL, much like other applications you install from Microsoft. SharePoint, SQL, really any application, you should consider what service accounts you want to use. As you can see here, I have some of these service accounts, and these service accounts are specific for different parts of the surface area for SQL that I would be using. Obviously you want to delineate your service accounts between production, test, and dev so that you don't get those confused. There are times when you may have to give out a service account or give out some of the service account information. Obviously you would only want to give out to developers or people in the test environment the test account credentials. And being a DBA, I rarely ever give out credentials to anyone. So moving forward, we're going to need to go ahead and mount our media to install SQL. When we do this install, there are some things that you want to make sure you do prior to the install. Part of that is making sure that you have all of your directories set up appropriately. I would always suggest, and this is part of best practices, that you install SQL with different LUNs. Given that this is a VM, it's not quite as necessary as it used to be with physical machines. However, if the back end of the VM is built properly, the LUNs point to storage that is separate, and so typically your data, your temp drive, and your log drive, you want those to be fairly quick drives. In this instance, we have obviously the OS drive separate from the data, the logs, and the tempdb. When you're installing SQL, you also want to have a directory in each one of the drives to delineate the location for the data files, the log files, and the tempdb files. So
I just simply create a folder, and in each drive we'll have a folder that's obviously named for what we want in them.
You can do a few other things when you install SQL to kind of give us better performance depending on the usage of SQL. we're not going to get too much into detail on this video as much as I just want to kind of focus on the basic installation of SQL and some of the things you want to work around. So now that we have the directories like we want them, we also want to prepare for a few other things. We're going to create service accounts, and we already have some of these service accounts, but some of these service accounts should probably be an administrator on the local box. This will be the service account for SQL Engine, and so I will add this as and I'll add this account rather, as well as the agent account as admins on this box. Apply and OK, and now we're ready to get started with the install. When installing SQL, you just kind of want to have these basic things laid out. We'll talk later on how to decide the proper resources for a SQL box, but for now we're just going to work with the install.
So nothing complicated here, we're just going to start the setup, and whenever it does respond, we'll move forward into doing a standalone install.
Okay, so there are plenty of options here that we can look at, and some preparatory things we can do to determine if the server is built properly and we have all the proper updates and everything. I'm going to skip all that and go straight to the installation. We're going to do a new SQL Server standalone installation, and the first window we come to is the product key. We're going to specify a free edition. We're not going to do that. We're going to leave it with the product key that it came with. This is again standard, so some of the options for enterprise will not be present in this installation. Obviously we're going to accept the license terms. I'm not going to deal with the customer experience information. And then we go through a number of checks to ensure that we have what we need to install SQL. I'm going to skip the update piece, and now we get to a window where we're going to choose which features we want to install. I'm going to install everything. I'm just going to go ahead and select all. And then down here you want to pay attention to this. This is where this is going to be the location of the actual install files for SQL. So this is going to be the location where the program files aspect of the SQL Server files will be located. This will differ in future from where we're going to have the actual data files and the log files, and I'll show you where to set that up. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and pick everything, and we're going to move from there. Okay, so when you install SQL, you have an option to have a default instance or a named instance. A default instance is always named MS SQL Server. It's also referred to by simply typing a period. You also have the option to put in a named instance. So if you were to have maybe multiple instances of SQL on a single server, you may not want to use the MS SQL Server. You may want to use a name like, for instance, this particular instance will be for CRM. If we were going to have multiple instances, I might name this instance CRM, but in this case I don't intend to do so. The default instance should be sufficient for what we need. And this is where it gets a little interesting when installing SQL. You have the different bolt-ons or the different applications or the surface area of SQL, and within this area here, we want to delineate which accounts we want to use. So in this, I'm going to fill out the different accounts that we have. So for instance, we do have a particular account.
Let me ensure that I have that right account information.
We want to make the agent automatic. The reason you want to make it automatic is that the SQL Server Agent is it's the functionality or the feature of SQL where you can run particular jobs that reference stored procedures, integration services packages, or other scripts that you may want to run for different purposes. If you do not have SQL Server Agent set up to be automatic, which is not default, what will happen is when you restart your machine, you will end up with your maintenance plans not running, with your scheduled jobs not running, and your ETLs not running, all of those issues, which really, in the end, there's no reason not to start SQL Server Agent on startup. Alright, so the SQL Server Database Engine. This one is obviously the most important of the install because this is the engine that runs the actual SQL Server services. So the databases and all of the objects and everything live within the engine services. If these are not running, SQL's not running at all. And we obviously want SQL Server Database Engine services to be automatic. You also have analysis services. Analysis services is utilized for data warehousing or building cubes for data analysis, typically now used in tools like Power Pivot, Power View, used in Power BI for just analysis of data. You have SQL Server Reporting Services, which is another feature of SQL, which also entails a web server for reports that are built within the framework of reporting services. If we choose to install these services, there will be extra configuration settings along with other services that will run on top of SQL Server and also consume resources. So just be aware of that. Integration services, this is where your ETL packages, where you'll run those from, and all of the different functionality within the ETLs will be run in integration services. And the other services right now we won't really need in this install. I'll skip down to the full text. If you have a need to utilize full text searches on fields that are full text, you'll need to have full text indexes, and you'll want this filter to be running so that you have the ability to create indexes on full text fields, which will speed up a lot of the queries that you run and things of that nature. Okay, now that we've moved beyond, actually I'm going to go back for a second. I want to look at collation. Okay, there are times when you're installing SQL where an application may require you to have a particular default collation for the database engine. If you need to pick a particular type of collation, you can do that. However, it's extremely rare for you to need to change this, and for the most part is unnecessary for us to cover in detail now. Again, be very aware of what your application, what the applications you will be putting in this instance require. But in this case, it's very basic and simple with CRM. Now, this is an area where you pick the type of authentication you'll have with your SQL Server. Typically, as a DBA in production, we don't want to be using mixed mode authentication unless we just have to. But given the fact that this is a dev machine, we will use mixed mode authentication, and we'll put some credentials in here, which I will keep very secret, and I recommend you do as well. Although I also recommend you keep them somewhere. Alright, so we have the account that we're setting up here will be referred as the SA account, and that account has sysadmin access or full access to SQL. You can basically do whatever you want to there. I'll also be adding my account to be an admin for now. In the data directories, this is where you need to make the changes to set the root directories up for everything that you've created before in the different drives that we have labeled. So the data root directory, I always put that on the D drive, aptly named, and I put it in the data folder. The user database directories, so this would be the data root directory. That'll be where it places all of your different database files, like the tempdb, this will be the master database, the MSDB. All of those database files will be located in this directory. You'll also want to change the user database location to be the same, and so we'll do that. And then we want to set the log as a separate drive. So the logs will go in, the log drive and the logs directory. The tempdb, we'll put all that into one drive, and that drive is here. And then the backup directory could be whatever, because we won't really be using that as a backup directory. Also, we have an option here for file stream. We don't need file stream. I go ahead and just set it up for now, just in case someone decides to use it specifically for the dev instance. But basically, file stream is where you will use blob storage to keep files that you would want to reference within the fields of SQL, but are located in shares elsewhere. That feature is not really necessary for this install, but I like to have it ready so I don't have to set it up later. Now, for analysis services, we're not going to be using that, but I'm going to add myself as an admin there, and I'm going to change the data directories there. I'm going to go ahead and make this same selection so the data will go in the data. Now, normally if you were building out a production instance and you were building for analysis services, you would want the analysis services files to be separated into other LUNs so that you're not driving or pulling from resources that are used for production engine services. But given that this is a dev server, I'm going to simply put everything in the same boxes for now. We want reporting services in native mode. We're going to install and configure it, and we don't really want it to have the SharePoint integrated mode. However, it's just going to install it. It's part of the install now and doesn't really give you an option to not do so. We're going to add ourselves as the distributed replay controller. We're not going to really do anything here for anything we're doing with this instance. However, those features are very useful in other situations. And then we're finally just going to install. Okay, so now we've come to the end of the install and we have a failure. Normally in a video we want to try to show the perfect version of something, but I think that doesn't teach a whole lot. So in my case, I want to look deeper into why this failed. Basically everything here shows that it installed successfully, with the exception of analysis services. And where we see the issue is that the analysis services could not start. Okay, well, let's go ahead and close this, and let's go find out why analysis services won't start. Now first, I would tell you that we should always look to the services for SQL to be started and stopped in the configuration manager for SQL. So here we have a list of the services, and we can see that a couple of them haven't started, and one of them is this analysis services. And so we're going to try to start the service in the configuration manager. I believe it will probably fail again, and then we'll go determine why it failed. It very well could be the user account and the permissions this user account has either on the local machine, or I could have some old credentials that haven't been used yet. This doesn't look like the service is going to start, and so we're also going to go look at the events. Okay, it failed to respond in time, so go look at the application log. We're going to find out what happened. File system error, access is denied. Okay, so it is likely that the only thing we need to do is to set the analysis services account up as an admin on this box. Again, this is a dev box, so we don't have to be too careful about what we set up as an admin. So now we're going to go back, and we're going to try to start this service again, and I have a feeling it'll start just fine. And we are good. So you will at times run into problems where you're installing SQL or any other application, and my suggestion is not to freak out or uninstall and reinstall or anything along those lines, but to kind of seek out what the issue is. In this case, we should have made that user an admin on the box to begin with. I will go through and have another video on the configuration manager and kind of talk about some of the options that are here. But to be clear, I want to make sure I state that anytime you work with the services of SQL, you want to use this, the configuration manager for SQL Server. If you have issues with it, you can always turn to services and the Microsoft Windows services features, but I would suggest first starting in the SQL Server Configuration Manager. Now, We have SQL installed and the features all seem to be running properly. We're going to close out of the installation and we're going to go double check and make sure everything installed properly. First, you want to look and make sure that in the data we actually have, in the data file, we have the folders that we would expect from the install. We also want to double check and make sure that the actual data files for the databases are in the data directory for the install of SQL. And as you can see, those are there. We want to look again in the logs and make sure that the logs show up appropriately, and they do. And finally, we want to make sure that the temp database shows up in the appropriate location, and it does. So now we have a full install. We want to go make sure that Management Studio is going to work. So to manage SQL, you use SQL Management Studio. And this is where the default instance comes in handy when you're using Management Studio and you want to set up you want to go to the default instance of SQL. You have a few options. You can type the name of the server, which will translate to the default instance of SQL on that server, or you can type just a period. When you do, it will allow us in, and we can take a look at what's available here in SQL. This is a standard instance, so you're not going to have always on features or anything along those lines. You will see that the SQL Server Agent has started. You do eventually want to set up some operators. I highly recommend that be one of your next steps. Also, if you need to do any kind of mail operations, you want to go ahead and set up the mail operations as well. Set up all of the information for mail in the database mail area. We're not going to go through that in this video. However, those are steps that you do want to take when installing SQL, especially when you're doing so for a production instance. For now, we see that the agent is running. We see that SQL Engine is running. I will also give a tutorial on using Management Studio, on the basic uses for Management Studio. If you like this video or if it helped, please like and share. Please subscribe to my channel, and I will continue to put out videos to help with different issues in SQL, as well as training for how to use SQL and the different features of SQL that you may find yourself using in the future. Thanks a lot, and God bless.